enter into the process of updating their comprehensive plans. And while the work of an organization like AFT is crucial in advocating for farmland protection, the voices of individuals like you who are on the ground in your communities, seeing what's happening to the land around you, your voices are essential in this process. So I want to thank you for being here and for all the work that you do towards our shared vision. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Danny Madrone, our Pacific Northwest Policy Manager, who's going to lead today's webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Addie, for the introduction. So I'm Danny Madrone, the Pacific Northwest Policy Manager for American Farmland Trust, joined by the Regional Director, Addie Candeeb, and also we have Chantel Welch in the background, who's going to be providing tech support and helping to field questions. We had a lot of people sign up for this training, which is really, really exciting. It makes me feel very validated in the work that we do here. So I really want to thank you all for being here. We had people sign up from all over the state. And we also had a few people who signed up that are nearby, but not in Washington. So just want to make sure folks know that this is specifically designed around how policy works in Washington, but there's still going to be relevant content for all communities that are working on the local level to protect farmland. A recording of this presentation and the slides will be sent to everyone who registered. So there's a lot of content that's going to be produced. So if you miss a few things, just know that you will get these slides as a follow-up. So don't feel like you have to write everything down as I'm speaking. So our mission at American Farmland Trust is to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We believe that all of these things are needed to really protect farmland for generations to come. And I like to start off with this quote. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And what I mean by that, especially when we're talking about land, decisions about land and natural resources impact all of us. Much of what a local government does is balance priorities for our communities, especially as they are planning for our future. And land is a limited resource. We're not making any more of it. Whether it is land that you farm, land that you'd like to access, or land that shapes your local food system and regional landscape, your interests need to be represented and you need to be at the table. So a quick rundown of our agenda here. We're going to start by introducing ourselves in just a moment. We're going to talk about why it's important to protect farmland and how farmland protection works in Washington state. I'll do some local land use 101, what I like to call the farmland edition. And then at that moment, we'll take a break and for any questions that come up. Then we'll get into, how public comment and public hearings, like ways to get engaged, how to identify a problem and offer a solution, and then also building community around advocacy. And then we'll have more time for questions at the end. That said, if you have a question that comes up as I'm presenting, feel free to pop it into the chat. If it's something that can be easily answered by our team, they can respond to you in the chat. If it's something that can't be easily answered by either one of them, but it's really relevant to understand what's on the slide, Chantel's going to jump in and ask your question for you so that I can answer it before I get too deep into the presentation. And if it's something that can wait until we reach a time for questions on the agenda, we're going to keep a list so that we can respond to them. And the goal of this training is that you leave with some talking points to support your advocacy efforts, and then you have some next steps to learn more about what's going on in your county and how to get involved. You're probably not going to leave here an expert on local land use planning or the Growth Management Act, but you're going to have some of the basic building blocks so that you can kind of understand what you're getting into and be prepared to learn more and get involved. So let's start with introducing ourselves. Your name, the county you live in, and then, tell us your farm, what organization you're a part of, or if you have some other role in the community, maybe you're just a very passionate farmland advocate. If you could answer this prompt and put your answer in the chat, and we'll get to know who's in the room here. I'll say for myself, my name's Danny Madrone, and I live in Thurston County, and I'm with American Farmland Trust. So I'll give a second for those to come into the chat.
Are we supposed to type it or do we speak it?
Oh, go ahead and type it into the chat.
Okay.
Excellent. Keep those rolling in while I move along, but I'll just say congratulations. This is the very first thing you need for a strong public comment to local government. So, why protect farmland? Start with this little tagline here. Do you eat food or know someone who does? That's a little slogan that we used to promote food summits down here in the South Sound over a decade ago to get people to the table. Of course, we all eat food. We are all have an interest in protecting farmland in that way. But communities that protect farmland and agriculture will have access to healthy food, be more resilient to climate disruption, be able to support ecosystem services, and have a stronger local economy. There's probably more things that we could add to this, but something to think about in your advocacy is how we frame the importance of farmland protection. And quickly, I want to talk about farms under threat. This is some research that was done by American Farmland Trust. Our team looked at development patterns on farmland across the nation from 2001 and 2016 to see where farmland was being lost to both urban development and low-density residential development. And then we modeled those trends forward to 2040. And you can see once you zoom in on Washington, you can start to see where those hotspots are for us. Washington lost nearly 100,000 acres of farmland in that time. And if we don't change this trend, we stand to lose another 192,000 acres of some of our best farmland if this does not change. And when we zoom in even closer and look at what this means for local communities, this is kind of what it looks like. Now, our modeling doesn't take into account zoning code or where exactly this loss will happen. So, when you look at these maps, you can't point to a specific place and say, wow, that farm's going to be gone. But it gives you a sense of the quantity of farmland that we stand to lose based on previous development trends. And this is actually quite shocking. This is a huge change for communities, and it's a big blow for local food systems. It's also preventable. Now, some farmland will be lost over time due to pressures of other land uses, population growth, stuff like that. But we can be more thoughtful and protect our best farmland to help feed this growing population. And when we zoom in closer, you can kind of see what this looks like on the ground. In the top, we've got north of Vancouver, in the middle, southeast of Spokane, at the bottom, east of Puyallup. You can see in these different areas, where housing has been built on farmland, where there is pressure to build on the next round of housing that'll go in or other type of development. And so when you zoom in like that, you can really see the threat that we're up against right here. And this is just looking at residential housing. There's also some emerging trends around warehouse development and other things that are threatening farmland. And so why is this harmful? Why is urban sprawl harmful for farmland? Well, for one, this is the permanent loss of farmland. We don't get it back once it's developed. This increases the cost of farmland, both because it has a value for development that farmers have trouble competing with, but also farmland becomes more scarce, which means there's less access for new farmers. We see the fragmentation of farmland. We see conflicts between neighbors. We see an eroded agricultural economy. If the tractor repair shop shuts down because there's not a critical mass of farmers to keep them open, that impacts all the farmers that remain. There's a greater carbon footprint as people are traveling further to get to urban centers. We see increased impervious services. We see competition for resources like water. And we have more mouths to feed with less land to grow food. So this should be top of mind for all of us. And then land access and future farmers. So the 2017 US Census of Agriculture reports that for Washington, each producer age 35 and for each producer age 35 and under, there are 5 who are 65 and older. This is a crisis for the agricultural community. We need more people who want to grow food and who are able to access land to be able to do it. In Washington, only 3.9% of producers reported as identifying as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. This is below the national average of 4.5%. And in a 2022 survey of the National Young Farmers Coalition, 65% of farmers on the West Coast identified finding affordable land to buy as their primary barrier. So this is a challenge for young farmers and future farmers in general. There's been disproportionate impact for BIPOC farmers. And so this is something to keep in mind. And now I'm going to introduce another prompt right here. So in the chat, we've got, a couple of questions you could choose from here. Why is farmland important to you? How does farming support your livelihood? How does agriculture contribute to your community? So I'll give us a moment to think through this prompt right here and go ahead and, think of a sentence or two and drop it in the chat. I'll read off a couple of responses before we move on, but I'll give you a moment to think about this and yeah, drop something in the chat. Oh, I was going to say, my example of that is farmland is important for me because I really like to eat. I like good local food. And I'm not very good at growing my own, and I wouldn't have time to do it anyway. So, for over a decade, I've been getting a CSA share from a Thurston County farmer. The same farmer has been providing food for me and my family. They've helped me raise my family, and that's why it's important to me. I see resiliency in the chat. We love growing food. That's great. Agriculture provides over 20% of employment in Chelan County, yet the ag land, primarily orchards, are the greatest threat for development. And, a personal connection here as someone that grew up on an orchard, I have a close connection to these farmlands and hope to see them preserved for future generations. Our family's been 100% supported by agriculture for 5 generations, and I'm not thrilled about the idea of moving. Farmland is critically important to keep our dollars in our community and to keep things local and seasonal in our diets. The more we import food from other countries, the higher the carbon footprint. Farmland is important because it provides us with locally grown food and is also pleasant to have nearby for peace of mind. Amen to that. We're going to need to feed our communities for generations. Long-term land tenure is the biggest barrier to me for farming full-time. Farming has supported our livelihood and that of our employees for 14 years. Farmland is important because we live on an island, and from an emergency preparedness standpoint, it is essential. Yes. Farmland has the potential to nourish communities, economies, and the environment if managed well, and I feel passionate about enabling this stewardship. Agriculture contributes to our community not just by providing local food to the local community, but by maintaining open space, preserving habitat for native and endangered species, and contributing to the local economy. I eat mostly from local and regional farms. I appreciate the values of people who grow food on the land. Oh, wow, I could keep going. These are so great. I am going to keep moving along so we don't run out of time, but keep dropping your ideas in the chat because this is inspiration for all of us. And again, these are statements that you can incorporate in your advocacy and in your messaging to decision makers who are going to be deciding the future of farmland. So keep it coming. This is really great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how farmland protection happens what specifically the state of Washington does to protect farmland. The primary mechanism for doing that is the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act is a regulatory framework for local governments to address population growth. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today. There are also some funding mechanisms for permanent farmland protection in Washington. There's the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program. That's through RCO, the Recreation and Conservation Office. There's a Buy, Protect, Sell partnership between the Washington State Housing Finance Commission and the State Conservation Commission. I'm not going to get into those programs right now, but always feel free to email me if you have questions about them. And then also programs that support agricultural viability, because we all know that it's not farmland without farmers. And so there are programs at Washington State Department of Agriculture, State Conservation Commission, the Washington State University Extension that support farmers in being successful. Now, this is kind of a three-pronged approach that the state of Washington provides for farmland protection. There are other ways to protect farmland in Washington, like through federal funding, land trusts, but this is specifically what Washington offers. And we will be focusing on the growth management component of it in this training. So what is the Growth Management Act? At a very high level, the GMA, as it is called, was first adopted in 1990 to regulate development. It requires fast-growing cities and counties to adopt a comprehensive plan for a 20-year vision, balancing 15 goals. And when we look at these goals, put yourself in the role of a local elected official. This is a big task to balance these 15 goals for the next 20 years for your community who has a wide variety of interests. And if you think about them, to a certain extent, all of them relate to farmland preservation to a certain degree. I look at reducing sprawl is really important for protecting farmland. Economic development, making sure that farm businesses are successful, natural resource industries, the environment, climate change, but all of these touch on farmland preservation to some degree, if you think about it, right? And so who is required to plan under the Growth Management Act? Well, the answer is that actually every county is required to do some level of planning, but the amount of planning varies county by county. Every green county you see on the screen here is required to plan fully. That means they have to develop a comprehensive plan that addresses certain elements. I'll get into that in a moment. The blue counties also have to do that, not because it was mandatory for them, but they opted into that full planning model. And then we have 11 counties that have to plan for critical areas and natural resource lands only. Now, they can choose to do a comprehensive plan if you want, and many of them do. They can choose to do that. They can choose what elements they put in, but they specifically have to address critical areas and natural resource lands. We'll be focusing on natural resource lands in this. Now, one thing that's interesting is that the 28 counties that do full comprehensive planning, they make up 95% of the state's population. And it's also important to note that the cities within these counties that do full planning also have to do comprehensive plans. And so unless they have a population of 500 or less, then they can opt out of certain elements. And so focusing on that part of preserving natural resource lands, every county has to do this. They must designate natural resource lands and identify strategies to preserve them. This is primarily achieved through zoning and zoning code. So what lands can be zoned for agriculture? First, they have to be not characterized by urban growth. So, lands that maybe receive municipal water services, sewage services, things like that, those would be characterized by urban growth and can't be considered for agriculture. The land has to be used or capable of being used for agriculture. And it has to have long-term commercial significance for agriculture. So counties must look at all the land they have that has prime, unique, and statewide important soils. And then from there, they can consider other qualities such as proximity to urban areas. They can look at parcel size. They can look at tax status. So while they have to consider all this land that has fertile soil, there's other things that they can consider on whether or not to zone it as agricultural land. And this has to be updated every 10 years. And so a periodic update is due every 10 years. You can see the schedule on the screen right here. The orange counties are due to update their plans and regulations by the end of this year, actually. It was supposed to be through June. They got an extension through the legislature. All the counties you see in this green yellow color are due for an update in 2025, by June 30th of 2025. Though there is a bill in the legislature right now to give them an extension through the end of the year. The gray counties, 2026, blue counties, 2027. They'll likely get extensions too, but we'll see. Local governments can also consider amendments that are initiated by their staff or by an individual on an annual basis. And so proposals are typically considered through an annual docket or a package. So, you know, there's a moment in time where you can propose a change to a comprehensive plan or some kind of land use policy code change, and it gets put into a package for elected officials to consider. Now, they might not consider everything that gets put in front of them because there are capacity issues, but they will create a docket and they'll go through those as the year goes on. So all of these changes, whether it's the periodic update or the annual amendment process, does require a public process, which includes a public hearing and a written comment period. We'll be getting more into that later. So it's a good thing to ask ourselves, is zoning enough to protect farmland? I think I'll give you a spoiler. No, not quite. But it does vary by county. You know, one quote that I've heard about counties is, if you talk to one county, you've talked to one county. Each area has very different conditions on the ground. You know, they all have to adhere to the Growth Management Act, but there's a lot of room for local control in there. And that's so that those conditions on the ground can be considered by local decision makers. Some counties allow non-farm uses on land designated for agriculture. You know, a couple of extreme examples of that include, you know, I know one county where a ball field was put on ag lands, and I know another county where a golf course was put on ag lands. Now, those are two extreme examples. That doesn't happen very often, but there are non-farm uses that can occur on agricultural lands, and it varies county by county. Counties can also de-designate farmland. Now, this requires a change of zoning, which requires a public process. But if somebody wanted to petition the county to de-designate some land from farmland to another use, there is a process to do that. And it's also, you know, worth noting, a lot of farmland is not zoned for agriculture. So we have a lot of fertile soils that, for whatever reason, was not included in the zoning. And, you know, that could be because the county thought the parcels were too small to be commercially significant. You know, we know farmers often will pull together several parcels so that they can have a viable operation, but those sometimes get left out of agricultural zoning. And then again, it's not farmland without farmers. If you zone land for agricultural use and it is great farmland, but there aren't the services there to support the farmer in being there, then have we really protected farmland? And now I'm going to get into two counties just as an example. This isn't necessarily a one county is better than the other. They're very different, but I'm just sharing this as different approaches that have been taken. There's more work to do in both of these counties. But I'm going to start with Whatcom County up here. Under our Farms Under Threat, you know, 2040 analysis, Whatcom County is projected to lose 6,300 acres by 2040 under the development trends that we saw from 2001 to 2016. The county has a goal to retain 100,000 acres of farmland. That's what they consider their critical mass to have a viable agricultural economy. And it's a very strong part of their economy. You can see all the land that is zoned here. It's quite a bit of this part of the county here where a lot of land is in production. Now they've only zoned, and they have over 100,000, just over 100,000 acres in production as reported in the 2017 Ag Census. So agricultural zoning accounts for 85,000 acres. And so that's what you see in green right here. This is all land zoned for agriculture in Whatcom County. So what they decided to do to try to make up that gap and get to 100,000 is they identified some areas that aren't zoned for agriculture. And sometimes it's difficult to zone new lands for agriculture, but they created these rural study areas. And you can see this on this map here. This is Whatcom County's map. These orange areas on the map, the county has said, okay, these are also important. These are areas that are zoned for rural residential, but they have agricultural significance. And they recognize there's a need for additional protection to protect agricultural viability in this. So this ongoing work in Whatcom County, I won't get into the details, but just an example of how they've approached something. Like I said, they've got more work to do. Right now, they're projected to lose more farmland than they want to keep preserved. So there's work to do in Whatcom, of course. There's work to do in every county. You'll hear me say that. And let's look at Thurston County. This is where I live. Now, Thurston County is projected to lose 9,800 acres by 2040 under that business as usual scenario. And just looking at Thurston County, you know, the green areas here, you know, here, this is where there is farmland. According to the 2017 ag census, they have 62,000, just over 62,000 acres in production, but they only have 15,500 acres here, a little bit over here, some up here that is zoned for agricultural land. And these are largely 20-acre parcels. I forgot to say in Whatcom, those are 40-acre parcels, so they're not allowed to break them down much more than that. There are some exemptions. In Thurston County, it's 20 acres. Now, these counties are very different. Whatcom's got a large base of agricultural lands. Thurston has very high-quality agricultural lands, but not as much and not in that big, gigantic swath that Whatcom County does. It's a little bit more fragmented here. But also one thing to note is that Thurston County had an appeal of their last comprehensive plan update. There was an organization that said, we don't think you've zoned enough agricultural lands to be in compliance with the Growth Management Act. And the Growth Management Hearings Board agreed. So Thurston County is currently in the process of designating more agricultural lands because they didn't use updated soils data when they had done it before. This is currently in progress in Thurston County. The Planning Commission has recommended adding 7,200 additional acres to the agricultural zoning, and that will make its way to the County Commission to consider. It's worth noting that zoning new agricultural lands, it's difficult because it does change the value of land. It limits what can happen on that land, so that land will have less value. And we have a lot of farmers in Thurston County who, you know, they have looked at their land values as their ability to retire. And so it can be quite controversial. It can be difficult. One thing that Thurston County does have to try to figure out ways to preserve agricultural land outside of, you know, that long-term agricultural zoning is they have this agritourism overlay. So this light green kind of speckled overlay here is an area where they're trying to help promote agritourism for the farmers in their county. I know agritourism can be a controversial thing county by county, you know, in Thurston, because there isn't that critical, you know, mass that Whatcom County has in terms of quantity of farmland. Farmers might need more diversified income to be able to stay on the land, but this is one strategy that Thurston County is employing to try to encourage more agricultural production and work through some of these sticky land use issues. So I mentioned before comprehensive plan elements, the comprehensive plan and the elements associated with them. So this is for all fully planning counties and cities. So the ones that have to go above and beyond just the critical areas and natural resource protections. There are mandatory elements of a comprehensive plan that have to be addressed. Land use is often where you will find all the things that I just talked about, but sometimes it's separated out into a different chapter. Housing, it can be an important one for farmland because we want most housing to get built in cities, but there's also rural housing needs too. Farm worker housing, for example. Rural development is an important element when we're thinking about farmland. Transportation can be important, to get, are there the right transportation facilities in place? Climate change can be important. Looking over onto the optional side, you'll see two that have stars by them. That just means that they were intended to be mandatory, but the state has not yet provided funding to support counties in developing those elements, so they remain optional until that time. But economic development can be really important for counties to support agriculture. Solar energy, that's a big one. If you're in Eastern Washington, this is an optional element that can be included in a comprehensive plan. Sub-area plans can also be a really unique way to help support farmland. In Thurston, we have a Nisqually agricultural area, and the county is currently in the process of updating that sub-area plan so that they can figure out more ways to support agriculture and other needs in the Nisqually agricultural zone. Ports are included on here, and maybe it's important for agriculture because they help with getting things to market. They can help with economic development, but not always the case. But this just gives you a basic framework of what is included and could be included in comprehensive plans. And so what are some other strategies to protect farmland other than zoning? There's a purchase of development right or easements. This is something that could be included in a land use chapter as a strategy. Transfer of development rights. It's been successful in King County, not so much other places, but another potential thing that could be included in a land use element, maybe even a housing element in a comprehensive plan. Right to farm. These are policies that support farmers in staying on the land, even when a new subdivision is built next door. Somebody buys a house in their new subdivision and they don't realize how early a rooster can crow. Well, that farmer is protected in continuing their operations, even if there is that conflict there. There's other things, infrastructure investments that counties can support, and there can be policies around these in their comprehensive plans. Could be, processing facilities. It could be water infrastructure, things like that. Business and marketing support. Goals around this can be included in the economic development chapter, along with workforce development, succession planning. And then also, maybe in the conservation chapter or other natural resource type chapter, collaborative water solutions. The counties can have goals around supporting collaborative water solutions. And then also voluntary stewardship. Not every county is enrolled in the voluntary stewardship program, but this is a mechanism to support environmental services while also maintaining agricultural viability. And there can be goals around this in comprehensive plans. I wanted to talk just real quick, about the conservation futures opportunity. So I mentioned purchase of development rights, purchase of easements as a strategy to protect farmland. One thing that is available to counties is the ability to levy a property tax. And this can be a local funding option for acquiring open space and development rights, and it can be used to protect farmland. Some counties are real good at this. Skagit County puts a lot of conservation futures dollars towards protecting farmland. Other counties have it as a strategy to incorporate with other types of land protection. Some don't really, they're starting to dip their toe into that farm protection water with conservation futures, but have largely focused on habitats. But this is a place where you could advocate to the county to say, hey, have you considered adopting conservation futures for the counties that don't have it? And you can see on the right, there's quite a few counties that don't. And also, if a county has conservation futures, can more of those dollars goes towards protecting farmland? The way that this works is that counties can adopt the conservation futures levy at a rate of 6.25 cents per $1,000 of assessed value. So what does that look like? Let's say you own a home that is worth $500,000 of assessed value. That means that you would pay $31.25 a year into the Conservation Futures Fund, along with all other property owners in the county at their rate. And that goes into the Conservation Futures Fund, and the county can use that to protect land. One thing to note about this is that Conservation Futures is subject to what is known as the levy lid. In 2001, there was an initiative statewide where voters approved a levy lid that says that property tax revenue cannot grow by more than 1% each year. So that means that if the total assessed property of a county goes up 5%, the conservation futures and all other property tax levies can still only grow by 1%. So that 6.25 cents gets driven downward. To lift it back up to 6.25 cents per that $1,000 of assessed value, it does require it to go to the voters. And so this is another thing that could be asked of counties, is to put, if they have conservation futures program in place, is to put it on the ballot to lift it back up to its original funding capacity. That can be a challenging thing for counties. Elected officials have a good sense of what their voters will and will not support generally. And property taxes are tough because that is, that comes out of people's pockets. It supports good things, but, sometimes people are feeling the pinch. King County did do this not too long ago. They found that their rate had dropped to 3 cents per $1,000 of assessed value over time. And they recently put it on the ballot. The voters supported it, and so they have more funding for conservation futures. But just something to note, that just because you have conservation futures in place, it does erode over time, and it needs to be either re-upped or just an acceptance that that revenue will erode over time. If this feels complicated to you, it is complicated. So I'm just giving you this context for something to think about. So one of the new elements in comprehensive planning is the climate change element, climate change and resiliency, which I see as a new opportunity to advocate for farmland. So this applies to the 11 largest counties and the cities within them for addressing greenhouse gas emission reductions. For the resiliency sub-element, so these are goals that improve climate preparedness, response, recovery efforts. All fully planning counties and cities do have to address this, and it must maximize economic, environmental, and social benefits and incorporate environmental justice. And so looking at along the bottom here, these are the 11 largest counties. So these are the counties that this applies to. You'll notice that the 4 central Puget Sound counties right there don't have to incorporate this till 2029, their next comprehensive plan update. The reason for that is just the timing of the legislation. Some of them are working on doing that anyway, and you could push them to do that. They are finishing up their comp plans by the end of the year, so it might be a heavy lift for some of them. But the first counties that will be required to incorporate this into comprehensive plans: Clark, Skagit, Thurston, and Whatcom. And so what does farmland and climate change have to do with each other? Well, quite a bit. Farmland protection is really important, supports the local food supply. It avoids future emissions by preventing urban sprawl, and it preserves opportunities to support climate adaptation and mitigation practices. Adaptation being, what are we doing to adapt as the climate changes, and mitigation being, what are we doing to reduce our impact on climate change. Climate smart agriculture includes soil health practices, nitrogen management, livestock management, agroforestry, habitat planting, other things. And then adapting to climate change, the resiliency component, improving irrigation systems, adjusting to changing temperatures and precipitation, protecting crops and farm workers from smoke and extreme weather. So now these are all things that we should be thinking about with these upcoming comprehensive plan updates, making sure that agriculture has a place in what counties are talking about when they're updating their comprehensive plans to address this new climate change element. So what's your next step here? I just gave you some nuts and bolts and a lot of information. What do you do with all of this? I would say the first thing that you should do is learn about your county, where you live. Read the comprehensive plan. Maybe not the whole thing. These are pretty lengthy documents. They address a lot of things that might not be of interest to you, but you can find the comprehensive plan on your county website, and you can hit Control F for agriculture, farming, farmland, farms, and find the areas that are relevant to you. And take a look at them. Do the goals that are in the current comprehensive plan for agriculture and farmland represent your hopes for the future? Are these goals being implemented? Are they leading to the right results? This will help you think about what you need to advocate for in the next comprehensive plan update that's coming up. Who are your elected and appointed officials? You know, you can get online. Who are your county commissioners or your county council, depending on where you live? Who's on your planning commission? Who's on the agricultural advisory committee? There's some special purpose districts you might look up. Who's on your conservation district board, irrigation district board? There might be others. There's lots of special purpose districts that can relate to agriculture. Also, look at who else is advocating for farmland in your community. Are there other farmers, community advocates, farmland preservation organizations that you can reach out to? And then learn about current processes that are happening. Your county will have this up on the website. So comprehensive plan periodic updates and the annual amendment process. There's planning processes and special projects. I just mentioned that in Thurston County, they're doing this Nisqually area sub-area plan. Some of this involves work groups. They want people in the community to come and help inform them. And often, as you're looking this information up, you'll see opportunities to sign up for updates. So the county will keep you in the loop as things are moving forward. And speaking of planning commissions review and provide recommendations to elected officials on changes to the comprehensive plan and local land use regulations. So these are people appointed by the elected officials to help advise them. Agricultural advisory committees provide recommendations to the planning commission and elected officials around agriculture. And these are the counties that currently have agricultural advisory committees. So think about that. Is your county on the list? If not, should it be? That could be a recommendation that you make to your local elected officials. If your county is on the list, reach out to these folks, talk to them, maybe apply to serve on it yourself if you've got some ideas on how to shape the future of agriculture. And I know I've focused a lot on counties. That's where most of our agricultural lands are at too. But I don't want to let cities off the hook. There's a role for cities to play here too. They also have this comprehensive plan obligation. And so whether they know it or not, cities do play a very important role in farmland preservation. First off, urban density and infill housing, concentrating population growth into urban areas, reducing pressure to develop farmland, and prevents the expansion of urban growth areas. So advocating at cities to allow more housing, there could be a lot of resistance to that. So elected officials need to hear support to do these things. Urban agriculture could be better supported in cities. That's helped support urban livability and food security while helping to cultivate that next generation of farmers, giving exposure to getting your hands in the soil and thinking of this as a career for yourself. And also cities can support markets for local food. They can develop food action plans, local food initiatives, farmers markets, farm to institution programs. They can do community education and outreach. These are all things that can be incorporated into a city's comprehensive plan to help support agriculture. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to take a sip of my tea. And I'm going to see if we've got questions that have popped up here that I can answer here. Okay, I see an interest in getting statistics at a county level. That was from Mo McKenna. I assume this is under our Farms Under Threat data. It's a little bit hard to pin down for Farms Under Threat on the county level because it was a national analysis, and we just want to be careful because it's not a parcel by parcel look that we're doing on those. But do feel free to reach out to us. All my email will be at the end of this presentation, and we can see about what county you're in and what kind of support we can provide in terms of our Farms Under Threat data. But it can be hard to pin it down to the county level just because it is a national data set, and the more and more you zoom in, the numbers might not be as precise as we'd hope, but do reach out around that. And I see that with assistance in agricultural viability, but there's an issue with farmers and landowners who don't want to be viable. Is there something that AFT is doing to encourage changes in ag usage at the local level? The problem that you're seeing is that farmers and landowners who are wanting development. Yeah, that is Joe. That is a challenge. You know, one of the things I mentioned about Thurston County is like being a little resistant to agricultural zoning because it reduces property value, and that sometimes a farmer's retirement is tied up in that. I think in that particular instance, supporting succession planning is one of the things that we're getting underway here at AFT, and there's other organizations working on that. But we also, I think really engaging with next generation farmers and getting more farmers at the table, especially at the county level, to say, no, this is our future and we want it. That's why I say, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. We need to get the farmers who want to stay in farming at the table, which is challenging because y'all work so hard. But one of the purposes of this training here is to help get more farmers and get their voices heard on farmland protection. Is agritourism considered a non-farm use? I don't know. Agritourism is considered a farm use. It's considered an accessory use to farmland. And there's certain regulations in place in terms of like, you know, how much of a land can be dedicated to something that's kind of like ancillary or accessory to a farm use. But agritourism, I believe, is considered an accessory use to farmland. It probably depends on the specific agritourism practice, but that, you know, some counties are wrestling with this right now, but that is considered an agricultural use in a lot of places. And again, it depends on what kind of agritourism. But you note that a number of farmers rely on visitors to keep their farm business viable and help protect land. Even if food isn't being produced on some parts of it, that is very true. Yeah, as I mentioned with the Thurston County example, like, you know, especially when farmland isn't as abundant as other places, sometimes farmers really depend on that diversified income. Does every GMA county have a stated ag acreage goal? No, I think actually, as far as I know, only Whatcom County does. Actually, you know, Skagit and King County, Snohomish might. I know that Whatcom does, but no, not everyone does. I think I forgot to say this on the Thurston County slide. They kind of have a goal around no net loss, at least the Thurston Regional Planning Council does with their Sustainable Thurston Plan. That's not a target of acreage, but no, I would say most counties don't have that kind of a goal in place. So what are good goals, actions, and strategies in a comp plan with metrics and accountability for implementation? That is a big question, Alan. And I'm not sure I can get too far into the specifics there, but I think, you know, some things that we could look at are, for one, you know, how much land is being protected, and if there's a target for acres to be protected. I think we could also look at things like, you know, how well is a voluntary stewardship program doing? What's the uptick there? Because one of the goals of voluntary stewardship is agricultural viability. You know, we could look at, and I'll get into this a little bit later, Alan, so, you know, maybe put a pin in part of this question, but there's also sources of data like the Census of Agriculture that can look at some economic factors, how much farmland is in production, how's that decreased over time, and other things that I'll get into a little bit later that might put some more shape to my answer to your question. How does this differ between incorporated and unincorporated areas? How does the city feel about this kind of policy? And of course, yes, it will vary by area. So, you know, incorporated areas and unincorporated areas. I've largely been talking about unincorporated areas where the county is the one who's doing the land use planning. In incorporated areas, cities are the ones doing the land use planning. And so I think largely cities don't think enough about farmland protection, which is why I included that one slide on like, and by the way, show up at cities too and tell them that they have a role to play. I think there is a little bit of resistance from cities at times to see that they have a role to play in the food system. And I think that applying some pressure there and making sure that they do know there is a role is important. So how does, oh, wait, I just read that one. Can counties opt in for the climate change and resiliency GMA element if we are not one of the existing required counties? Oh, So anyone who has already opted in, if you're not one of the 11 counties that are required to do it, any county can plan around climate change and resiliency. Like I said, there are counties that aren't required to create a comprehensive plan at all, but they still do because they recognize the value to it, and they can pick and choose the elements. So if you live in a county that is not required to do climate change planning, that's something that you could ask them to work on and say, hey, I know we're not required to do this, but I'm really worried about our future. And I think that we should get ahead of some of these issues and start planning now. So they absolutely, yeah, there's nothing that stops a county from planning, or, well, I shouldn't say that. There's nothing that stops a county from planning around climate change. But certain ones are not required to. So Clark County has 31 advisory boards, commissions, but we don't have an ag advisory commission. We keep asking for one, but no movement from the county councilors on it. Would love advice on how we can make one happen. So this is a good opportunity, and we'll talk a little bit more just towards the end of this presentation on what it looks like to build a more public campaign around something. But I would say, start organizing. If you want an ag advisory committee in Clark County, start pulling people together, start showing up at public comment and offering your thoughts. I'm going to give some tips into that into just a moment. Write letters to the editor, really elevate it in the public eye so that you can't be ignored. I think sometimes, with decision makers, they have so many things in front of them, that, sometimes someone comes, they give one public comment and they never come back. And it's like, well, maybe that isn't a big priority. But if somebody continues coming back over and over again, and if it's different people, and if it's farmers, they'll be like, whoa, I think there's something here. Staff, look into this, and staff will start to look into it. Actually, I do know you have one county commissioner there who is favorable. And so, set up a meeting with her, ask her how she can be supported in moving that forward. So there's a couple of tips, but I'll get into a little bit more on some strategies in a bit. Oops, sorry. We found that in Chelan County, there's about 50% of currently producing land zoned for commercial agriculture, and the rest is spread out to other uses, urban growth area, rural residential 5, 10, et cetera. The farms, primarily orchards, have no protection in the code if they are not zoned for ag. For those that are, there are still many opportunities for development, cluster subdivisions, one-time splitting of the lot, vacation rentals. So what advice is there on how the comp plan in this situation could support preservation? So one thing that you can do here, as I mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to create new zoning for agricultural land unless a county is forced into it. Even when they are, it's really challenging to do that. But some of the strategies that have been used, and actually Whatcom and Thurston were both examples of that, is creating kind of like a separate zoning class called an overlay. And so they could look at where are the areas of our county that are not currently protected with ag zoning. And let's capture those it's called an overlay. It's a term in GIS mapping, and find ways that we can specifically support those areas. So that's something that you could advocate for that is not as scary to elected officials as changing zoning of an area. So Whatcom County is an example of how they've done that to try to target some specific areas that they know is really important for agriculture, but is not included in the zoning. And they're actively working on solutions for those areas. So is there an agreed upon definition, set of criteria that describes long-term commercial significance that all counties use? Or is that term variable according to place and/or economic paradigm? With impacts of climate change becoming more clear, who is rethinking the definition of long-term commercial significance in future scenarios with reduced fossil fuel use, ag chemical dependent food production systems? The belief systems of the definition really needs to be investigated and analyzed. Do the old definitions have relevance for today and in the future? So there are minimum guidelines. Oh, sorry, I got fuzzy for a second, so I'm gonna come off camera and then come back. So there are minimum guidelines for that are prescribed through the Growth Management Act in terms of what a county must consider for commercially significant agriculture. But there is also, and that's, I don't have them on the top of my mind in terms of what those are, but certain things like looking at the soil conditions. But there are, in terms of other guidelines that a county might also put on, there is a lot of local control there in terms of what they can consider. Increasingly, people are talking about access to water. Like, is this going to be viable in the future? My hope would be that we steer towards collaborative water solutions to figure out how we keep those lands viable. And counties, to a certain extent, have an obligation to help keep lands viable. But there is a lot of interpretation that can happen at the local level in terms of what does commercial significance mean. So yes, there are minimum guidelines at the state, and also there is leeway for counties to place their own guidelines as long as they're meeting the minimum requirements that are required through the Growth Management Act. And those need to be reassessed, as we're talking about climate change. Again, my hope is that we focus on how to make farms more resilient. But I think we have some realities to face. In California, they're repurposing lands that are drying up, in the San Joaquin Basin. They're looking at intentional repurposing of some lands in that area of California, and that grows a lot of food for the country. So this is getting to be a bigger conversation. So any ideas for strategies to consider for the importance of small acreage parcels with great land? A few acres can be sustainable for a vegetable farm, and most new farmers simply won't be able to afford a 20 to 40 acre parcel, even where development rights have been purchased. So this is a big challenge for small farmers, right? Because it's already difficult to afford even that 5 acres, especially when you're competing with people who just want 5 acres in the country. But again, this is where I think an overlay, like the rural study areas that Whatcom County has done, and creating an overlay of areas that are still significant for agriculture, but not zoned for it, could come into play here to help create extra supports for agriculture and also extra protections for farmland without having to get too deep into a sticky conversation around zoning. I think there's other strategies that could happen here too, especially as it pertains to economic development and supporting farmers and having extremely viable businesses so that they can stay on the land or access that land. There's a lot that I could say here, but I am running out of time. I'm going to take this last question here. Have you heard of any particularly radical strategies that have succeeded in creating a strong financial disincentive for speculative land purchases? Not particularly. And, part of this comes down to, constitutional property rights and stuff like that. It's a really, really sticky thing to get around. The more innovative stuff is, how do we have the resources that when land hits the market, we can compete with everybody else who's on the real estate market for that land. So for example, I mentioned earlier, there's a buy, protect, sell strategy that's now in place in Washington. So when land hits the market, it's really expensive. A farmer probably, or maybe could not afford it, even if they wanted to have access to that land. So there's now an opportunity for a land trust to apply for a low interest revolving loan, compete in the market, buy that land, then they can apply for an easement that protects the land in perpetuity and also reduces the value of it because it no longer has development rights on it. And then they sell that land to a next generation farmer at a reduced cost. So there's innovative ways to get around the other side of that one. I haven't yet heard of anything in terms of how you can succeed in disincentivizing that speculative land purchases on the front end of things, other than zoning. But that does get to be controversial. Okay, I'm going to take one last question and move on. As a flower grower in Kitsap, you'd love to hear more about other growers in other counties and strategies for mobilizing this community to support farmland advocacy. Our flower community is well connected and passionate about growing. We feel like it's an untapped support that these growers care about. That's not something I specifically have information for, but honestly, if there's somebody in the chat here who has heard of flower growers mobilizing together that can provide some information for Stacy, like please drop that in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and move along in the presentation to make sure I've got time to get through everything, and take another quick sip of tea before I move on. And do continue to put questions. There'll be more time for questions at the end of this. So now we're going to get more into like the strategies for influencing local governments. And so public comments, public hearings. This is your opportunity to go in front of your local elected officials, and those 2 prompts that we shared already, like what's your name, what county you live in, what's your farm or your organization, why is farmland important to you? You already started writing a public comment, so good job. Public comments are required at all business meetings, whether it's your county commission, your city council, your planning commission, ag advisory board. Anytime they're having a business meeting, so they're there to make decisions, they're required to have a public comment period. That's often at the start of a meeting. Sometimes there's limitations in terms of has to be on the agenda, but that's more often than not the case. That is more often not the case. I don't know if I said that correctly. There's also public hearings. Public hearings are a little bit more formal in that it's an opportunity to comment, but it's tied to a specific decision. So when a comprehensive plan update is happening, there'll often be a public hearing on each chapter as it comes along. If there's an amendment to a comprehensive plan, there'll be a public hearing for each amendment. And most land use decisions will require a public hearing. And so you will see these pop up on schedules for local electeds and planning commissions and such. And so that's the difference between those 2, but they're also largely the same. Well, for one, since COVID, remote options must be allowed. This is on the books in terms of the Open Public Meetings Act. Local governments have to provide an opportunity for remote testimony if feasible for them. Of course, there might be obstacles to that for the local government. Often it's a default option now these days, but sometimes you might have to let them know in advance that you'd like to testify, but you need to do it remotely. It might be really helpful if you're a farmer and you're coming in straight from the field to give some public comment. You don't have to show up at, at the county building in your dirty overalls, or maybe you want to do that, but it can also help with saving time and just having more comfort in being able to do stuff like this. Written testimony is also accepted. So, in terms of like a public comment, which is more informal, you can always email your elected officials, your planning commission, your ag advisory board if you have one. You can always send them an email. Do keep it concise, like you'll be required to if you give verbal testimony. But that is always an option for you. In a public hearing, there is a written testimony period. So there are certain days. There's a written comment period where you can send in your comments, and it becomes part of the record for that specific decision that they're discussing. And your testimony is a public record. If you are at a public meeting and you are giving your thoughts, that is recorded. It becomes part of the public record. If you email your county commissioners or city staff, that is a public record. And if it's part of a hearing, it becomes part of a packet of all the comments received. So it's a good thing. It documents and it preserves your voice. It's also a good thing to be aware of. And then time limits. If you're giving verbal testimony or a verbal public comment, there's often a time limit of 2 to 3 minutes. That is not a lot of time. So let's go to my next slide right here. It takes a lot of time to prepare a good comment. And this quote from Mark Twain, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." It takes time to get through your thoughts and get to the essence of what you'd like to say. So make sure that you do give yourself the time to do that. It's also important to know who your audience is. Of course, when you're speaking directly to decision makers, elected officials, or appointed officials, they are your primary audience, but other people are listening too. Planning staff, other advocates, the media. If a journalist picks up on like, whoa, farmland protection sounds like it's becoming a really big issue, I'm going to listen in on this. You might have media listening in, and you might see yourself, quoted in the paper of like, oh, this farmer came to public comment and said this, and it was, and then it helps lift up your story. They call that earned media. And then also the broader community, like, other people, maybe they're there to testify about a whole nother issue, but they're hearing you speak, and they're like, oh, wow, this sounds important. I think this is an important issue, and they'll start talking about it too. And so here's another opportunity for another prompt here. What's the problem? How does farmland loss impact you, and how does it impact your community? Do you have a specific example that you can offer? And can you speak to why this problem is so urgent that you want elected officials to take it up and take it up now? So think on these 3 questions. You don't have to answer all of them again, but start dropping some things in the chat here, and I'll read off a few examples as they come in. But this is another critical component of writing really good public comments, or offering a good public comment, or speaking at a hearing. And I'm just going to give some time for people to think it through and drop some things in the chat. Farmland loss impacts my community by needing to rely on other places to obtain food. It passes off our self-reliance. Yeah, that is very true. Maybe I've worn you guys down with all this information. That's okay, though. Oh, here we go. Here's another one. When housing development is put adjacent to an existing orchard, it often becomes impossible for the orchardist to continue to farm, despite our Right to Farm Act. That's a good point. Right to farm is sometimes good in concept, but implementation is hard. With rising land prices, decreasing pricing for product in market, and lack of succession, neighbor conflicts accelerates the conversion of more orchard land. It's a domino effect. Yes, that is so true. Don't want the area to look like Mill Creek or any other suburb. That's right. I mean, like, Alan, what you're getting at is the connection that we have to the place where we live. And these are changes that cannot be rolled back once they're done. Our county's farmland loss rate is higher than other nearby counties. Loretta, I know you're in my county, Thurston. That is very true. That makes her think about how inadequate our policies are in Thurston County. All right. Well, that's a good few examples right there. Oh, here's one more. I'll get one more and then I'll move on. Once it's gone forever. We need to bring farmland and farming back to the forefront and not allow our county and officials to continue to minimize this economic, climate, and economic, climate, and ecosystem benefit. Yes, thank you, Stacy. Oh, okay, here's one more. Farming is my main community. The diversity of crops and products that result from small farms on our island become the fabric. Oops. Another one came in. Become the fabric of our community. Less farming equals less community. And then there are many new farmers who would love to provide good quality food to our community, but land access is already a huge issue. With farmland loss, this issue becomes an even bigger struggle. Farmland is under constant development pressure from state agencies who are looking for locations to build a new airport. I think you might be in Thurston County too, Jennifer. Actually, I've eaten the meat that you've produced, I'm pretty sure. From community housing needs, and from farmers who are looking to fund their retirement by selling land at higher prices to housing or warehouse developers. These pressures are increasing, and we need more options for addressing these competing needs. We also need to treat our farmers like the stars they are, and prioritize them. Oh, yay, Thurston County. Jennifer, I think I saw you speak at a recent event. It was lovely. All right, well, if you guys have more thoughts, keep dropping them in there so that we can all see them and inspire each other. Maybe it's not so inspiring to highlight the problem, but it does build community to know that we're not going through this alone. Like, this is happening across the state. So when we're talking about the problem, there's different types of data that we can talk about. So everything that we just offered in this chat is qualitative data. It's somebody's personal experience and somebody's observations. And Alan, you asked earlier about like, what are the things that we can look at for measure, like what are the things that can be counted and measured to know that we're making progress? For one, there is the USDA Census of Agriculture. They have data like how much land is in farms and how has that changed over time. And this isn't just land in farms that is lost to development, like our Farms Under Threat data at American Farmland Trust. It's also like how much land was in farming, but the farmer left the land because there were too many obstacles for them to be able to stay on it. So you can look at how much land is in farming. You can look at economic data. I know in a lot of places we're seeing that agriculture is actually bringing more and more of an economic force into the communities while farmland is declining. It's a really weird trend. And like that, and to me, highlighting that for a county might show, hey, we need better protection of farmland because it's good for your local economy. You can look at farms by size. You can look at farmer demographic information. You can look at types of crops. This is all available through the USDA Census of Agriculture. And those of us who like to talk about data, who like to get nerdy with these things, the 2022 Census of Agriculture is being released next week. And we're so excited about that. I expect we're going to see some trends that aren't so great when that comes out. But there's about to be a new round of data coming out that can be fresh in front of our elected and appointed officials. And it's easy to find the data for your county. If you just Google USDA Census of Agriculture, Thurston County, you know, when I Google that, it's the first thing that comes up is a 2-pager about Thurston County and the information that in a very concise form. So they do have these 2-pagers. That's the 2017 census data. It may take a while for them to develop those for the 2022 census data, but it can be easily found that way. You can also ask if you've got a WCU extension office in your area. They are tracking this data. Conservation districts track this data for their local area. So you can reach out to some friends and friends or make new friends in these spaces to figure out what kind of data they're tracking and what you could use to put some more shape behind the problem that you've identified. So, you know, qualitative data is really important, and elected officials will love to hear that. They also love to hear numbers and data to know that it's not just your experience, like this is a county-wide issue. And the one thing, and I would say like the final thing to incorporate into a really strong public comment is an ask. It's one thing to come to your elected officials and say, I've got this big problem. It's another thing to give them something solid that they could actually do about it. So how can the decision maker be the hero in your story? And if they're talking about a very specific issue, you know, if you're at a public hearing and there's some land use decision that you don't like it, you think it'll be bad for agriculture, or maybe you really do like it, tell them that. Say, I want you to vote no on this and go back to the drawing board. Like this isn't meeting our needs. And you know, always show up and say yes if you think something is cool, because they might be hearing from other folks that they don't think it's cool. But show up and say yes when they're on the right track. That's really important. But if you want them to vote a certain way, be explicit. And so, what are some tangible asks? You know, we talked about forming agricultural advisory committees in places that don't have them with staff support. You don't want to just have like an agricultural advisory committee that doesn't have the support they need to do good work. You want them to have staff support, and you want them to have staff that are knowledgeable on agricultural issues so that they can help support the agricultural advisory committee in developing good recommendations that are going to move the needle. Funding for farmland protection. We already talked about conservation features. There are other options, but not many for local governments. But conservation features is the big one. You can request investments in economic development, including infrastructure. This could be water infrastructure to support some collaborative water solutions. This could be meat processing facility. We've been talking about that in Thurston County. Like, there's certain things that farmers need collectively so they can all be successful. What's missing in your community? That's a good recommendation to put into a comprehensive plan around economic development. And then, as you're reviewing the comprehensive plan for your county, are there specific changes you'd like to see in there? Are there some land use regulations that maybe don't work well or could be strengthened? So you could look through those and see, like I said before, as you're looking through the goals that are in the current comprehensive plan, what's not working, what's missing from there. And then, you could also ask them to set a target for a number of acres to preserve. And it can also be a strategy in a comprehensive plan to make a plan. You could have a strategy. You could have a strategy in a comprehensive plan to develop an action plan or a strategic plan for agriculture that addresses things like land protection, economic development, supporting ecosystem services, climate change, all of those things. Because sometimes counties can't do everything in a comprehensive plan. We saw the long list of things they need to address, but having a goal that in the next year or 2 years or whatever the time frame is, they're going to focus on this. That is something that can be included in a comprehensive plan. So maybe you're unsure of what to ask for, and that's fine too. Sometimes we know the problems because we're experiencing them, but thinking of the solutions is like, that could be a lot of work, but there might be other people in your community who've already been thinking about it. So check in with other folks, as you're finding who your allies are in this work. Some people may have already thought through some things, and maybe putting several minds together, you can brainstorm some solutions together. But one of the very simple things you can ask for if you don't have a solution is to ask for a follow-up. You come, you say, hey, this is who I am. This is why farmland is important to me. This is the problem that we're facing on the ground. And I would like to speak with somebody about this issue so I can share more about my concerns, learn more about the issue, and find out how I can be a part of the solution. Decision makers love it when people want to be a part of the solution. Or you could say, I'd like to invite you to my farm so you can see the challenges I'm experiencing and what we're at risk of losing. Let's talk about solutions. So this is a very simple ask that you can include that will get some follow-up, hopefully. So some tips for public comments, for public hearings. Speak from the heart. You're talking to people. You are a person. Share your experience. It can be a vulnerable thing to do, but I encourage you to speak from the heart. And maybe watch a public meeting, get a sense of the process so it's not so daunting going in the first time. You can watch past meetings online. You can show up and just observe a meeting and just see how it goes. Also, write out your full comments if you're giving a verbal comment and practice reading it aloud with a timer. It's amazing how quickly time goes. I'm like, oh, wow, I've got 10 more minutes to finish this up. Don't worry, I'm almost done. Show up early to the meeting, sign up before the meeting starts. They often have a sign-in sheet so they know who's there to speak. Use titles, commissioner, council member, committee member, be respectful. Be respectful is the next one too. Avoid inflammatory rhetoric, respect differences of opinions. Elected officials are people, decision makers, they're all people. Rarely is anybody out to get you or intentionally trying to cause harm. And if you come in hot, sometimes people shut down and they don't want to hear from you. So be respectful. And then follow up. After you come in and you offer your voice, send a thank you email. Say, hey, thanks. I'm so glad there was time for me to speak with you at your recent meeting. You could actually copy and paste your comment into an email or just reiterate your ask and make yourself available. Again, hey, can we have a cup of coffee and talk more about this? Or, hey, would anybody like to come out to my farm? How can I get more engaged with you on this issue? And this is my last slide here, I promise. So advocacy is a community effort. So first off, I say, be in it to win it. The real policy change comes from building relationships for long-term success. And when I say long-term success, getting a really great strategy into a comprehensive plan is a great success. Making sure that it gets implemented as it should is ongoing work. So, be in it to win it. This is a long game. We're talking about protecting farmland for future generations. So it's not going to happen in one go. Find your allies. Who else is impacted? What other organizations are active, whether they're formal or informal? Which officials have offered to help? If you're giving verbal comment and you notice that somebody at the dais up there is making eye contact with you, taking notes, maybe that person is an ally. So reach out. Other ways to engage. So letters to the editor, or also doing opinion editorials for local newspapers. Your public comment that you write, that 2 to 3 minutes, can easily be turned into a letter to the editor to submit to your local paper. And if everybody who's interested does that, that can really raise awareness on an issue. You could also work with others to table at community events and in public spaces, hosting town halls. You could host a farm tour. You could do other events, and make sure you invite those decision makers so that they're not just hearing from you, they're hearing from everybody, and they're also part of the community, And then finally, don't burn yourself out. Advocacy it's a long road. And if you don't take care of yourself, if you burn yourself out, then all the work that you do might just fizzle away. And that's a sad thing. So make sure that you take care of yourself. And part of that is celebrating your successes. When something really cool happens, make sure to take a moment and be like, wow, we worked hard for that and we got it done. That is so cool. And take a beat, take a breath before you look at what's next. All right. And that is the end of my presentation. And we've just got a few minutes left here, but I also, can stay on longer if there are a lot of other questions here. I'm going to jump over here. Oh, just one from Alan so far. Are support staff responsible to committees or their county supervisors? GMAs are run through planners and not through implementers of supporting county activities. GMA planning is about restrictions on land use. I would say it varies county to county in terms of the level of accountability a staff person feels around goals that are not specific to land use. And it depends on what that county invests into. If we're talking about economic development efforts for supporting agriculture, if a county hasn't hired somebody to work on that within the county, then there's a risk that some of the goals in the comprehensive plan are not going to have the momentum that they need behind them to be implemented. And so that's another thing that can be asked for. I've been talking a lot about comprehensive plans and the strategies in them, and how to advocate for that through the comprehensive planning process. There's also budget processes that that local governments do that also have public hearings. And so if you're concerned that there's a strategy in the comprehensive plan, maybe it's in the current comprehensive plan and it's not being implemented, showing up at a public hearing for a budget with all of your friends who agree with you and saying, hey, in the next budget, we want a staff person dedicated to implementing this goal. That is one way to support that. So, Alan, you're right that GMA is largely about restrictions on land use. It can be more broadly interpreted, and is by many places in terms of other long-range goals for community. But the county also has to invest in making those goals a reality. So, Alan, I hope I answered your question. And I'll also give an opportunity too, if people want to raise their hands and put voice to questions. I've been reading them off just for simplicity since there was a lot of interest in this training here. But if people want to raise your hand and ask a question too, please feel free to do that. I see, Diane, is there a plan to put this amazing presentation into print format? Interestingly, we are going to be working on a project around agricultural viability, specifically for the Puget Sound area. And one of the products of that is going to be a toolkit for local governments on how they can support the viability of agriculture in the Puget Sound area. So that will be, a couple years out probably, because there's a lot of work to go into that, a lot of communications with farmers and stakeholders. But like I said, I will be sending these slides out. So that's a starting point for you, Diane. But it's a great idea, having community toolkits so that people can easily access this information. This is maybe a first step. And we'll think about how we can further spread the word. We wanted to do something now since comprehensive planning is underway in some areas. All right. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Sorry, I'm looking through the chat now to find some. So where can we find more information on buy, protect, sell for Washington State? And actually maybe Addie or you could put some information in the chat around the Washington State Housing Finance Commission and State Conservation Commission websites for that. That is a resource that is like land trusts are the ones who have to initiate those processes, so they can't be initiated by farmers themselves. So that it's not it is a very specific strategy, but if we could drop those links in the chat so people could learn a little bit about those opportunities. There's a question here. Would you recommend having a consultant work with our county for our farm planning process? Yes. Well, depends on the county. If you've got some internal staff experts who are very good at agriculture, then maybe they have the internal resources, maybe they don't have the capacity, but often local governments will hire consultants to bring on additional capacity or expertise they don't have. And so if that's something you think your county needs, getting engaged in the budget process, again, there'll be a public hearing for that. Say, hey, in your next budget, I would like you to include money for a consultant to support an agricultural plan. That's a very realistic expectation to have of a local government. Whether or not they have the funding to, again, they're balancing tons of priorities, but if you don't ask, you're probably not going to get it unless you already have an elected official who's advocating for that behind the scenes. Let's see. Sorry, my document with all the questions just shut down on me. Oh, I see. That's Addie there. Oh, and okay, Chantel just dropped into the chat a survey we're hoping to be able to get a sense of who it is we're serving with these types of events. Was it useful for you? Did you learn what you were hoping to learn? Is there more that you're hoping to learn? Did this format work for you? Do you plan on getting engaged in your comprehensive planning process? And do you feel more equipped to do that? So if you have time, we would really appreciate if you take that survey that was dropped into the chat just now by Chantel. We'll send it out also with the email afterwards with the information. But yeah, if that was something I forgot to mention before, so Chantel, thanks for saying it. And I don't see any more questions popping into the chat. I don't see any hands going up, and it's 11:30 on the dot. Wow, look at that. I really want to thank you all for being here. I see some familiar names, but I also see a lot of new names as well. Oh, I see one. Oops. One last question. Does AFT have access to a pool of funds that could be used to act quickly when land becomes available in in a buy, protect, sell situation until a program can act to implement the objectives of that protection? That's not us, but it's the Washington State Housing Finance Commission that has it. It's called FarmPI, P-A-I. One of the links that Addie has dropped in the chat here, right above the link for the survey and find your local land trust, the WSHFC link, that is the state agency that has resources for that quick acquisition of farmland when it hits the market. So you can find more information there. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been really great. I love to see so many people showing up to support farmland protection in Washington State. Thanks for joining us. And again, we'll follow up with more information and yeah, this has been great. Thanks for being a wonderful, engaged crowd here. And I will let you off for the rest of your day. Thanks for being here.